So good morning, everybody, and welcome to this Action Sustainability webinar. So I'm EJ Allen. I'm a senior consultant at Action Sustainability. I've been working in the field of sustainable supply chains for about 20 years, and I spend most of my time these days supporting organisations with their modern slavery and labour exploitation due diligence. I also lead and facilitate something called the Built Environment Against Slavery Group, which is a bit of a mouthful. That's the UK's largest anti-slavery collaboration in the UK in the built environment sector. So we've got an hour. What we're going to be doing is looking at due diligence in relation to modern slavery and labour exploitation. So I'm going to start off by ensuring we're all on the same page in terms of what we mean by slavery and also by due diligence. And then we'll work through a guided maturity assessment to help you understand what good looks like and how your progress compares to others, I suppose, on the call. Okay, a bit of housekeeping to start with. We've muted your microphones and turned off your cameras just because of the sheer number of you. If you have any questions, you should see the Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Hopefully, crossing my fingers, we'll have time for some Q&A at the end, although I can't promise, as there's a lot to go through in 1 hour. We're going to be using a platform called Mentimeter to facilitate the interactive side of the session, which is critical. We'll use it all the way through, and I'll share instructions on how to do this in a minute. But rest assured, it's really simple. You don't need to download any apps or anything. Lastly, we're recording this. We'll be sharing the slides with you, the recording and all the poll results after the session. So hopefully you can kind of just sit back and listen and get involved. So I want to start by finding out a bit more about just the types of organisations we've got here today. So if you could all grab your phones, or if you've got 2 screens on the go, either go to menti.com and pop in the code or just scan the QR code there. Okay, I'll just let you do that for a second. I'm going to change my screen. Okay, so I can see the number of you as and when you join. So we've got 5 of you at the moment. So I'm just going to hang on for more of you to join. And do leave this open in the background because this is how we're going to do the assessment a bit later on. Everything on Mentimeter is anonymous. So I have no idea as we go through the session who submitted what. So when you're assessing your levels of maturity, nobody knows who submitted what, so do feel free to be very honest there. Okay, I can see 26 of you are in there, so I'm just going to hang on just a moment more. Okay, what I'm going to do, I'm going to go onto this screen here, and I'm going to make it so you can see the QR code still. What I'd like you to do is simply just tell me what kind of organisation you're representing today. So the question appears on the screen, but you can look at your phone and you can just say which kind of type of organisation you're from. Clearly, there will be plenty of you who don't fall into any of those categories. Apologies. So just pop in other there. That's fine. And you've got the QR code there if you still aren't in. And at the top of the screen, you can see the code. It says menti.com and the code is there. So hopefully, if you're not in, you'll be able to get in a moment. Of course, 11 others. What have we got here? So we've got some manufacturers, we've got some government, some NGOs or academic organisations, suppliers, subcontractors, recruitment agencies, consultancies. Okay, right, so I'll leave that open in the background so you can carry on popping in your responses there. So let me just go back to my slide deck. So a little bit about us. So who is Action Sustainability? So we've been around since about 2006. We're an award-winning consultancy. We provide advisory services and tools for all aspects of social, environmental and economic sustainability. From a modern slavery perspective, we've been collaborating in this space since back in 2014, just before the Modern Slavery Act came out. Here are some of the clients we've supported with their modern slavery due diligence, so both in their own operations and their supply chains. Central government, built environment, infrastructure, financial services, local authorities, media, facilities management, so quite a range of sectors there. In terms of our offering, we support organisations in identifying strengths and opportunities to improve their modern slavery due diligence. We do this with our maturity assessment against best practice outlined in something called BS 25700. It's the British standard organisational response to modern slavery. If you're not familiar with that, have a look. It's free, it won't cost you anything. It's really practical guidance. It's a guidance standard and it looks at what organisations should have in place to combat slavery and labour exploitation across their operations and their supply chain. So what we're going to do today is a bit of a taster of what that offering is. So we also help our clients to identify, assess and prioritise modern slavery and labour exploitation risks and impacts in, again, their operations and supply chain. We develop the knowledge and competency of people to help them understand, I suppose, what slavery is and labour exploitation, why it matters, and what steps they can take in their role. So if I think about the last year, I've trained thousands of people and facilitated a huge number of workshops, everything from engaging board members right through to training for site managers, procurement, supply chain and commercial. And we also develop e-learning modules as well. From a procurement specific perspective, we develop procurement toolkits. So here's an example on the left-hand side here of some practical technical procurement guidance we published last year on responsible sourcing of solar PV, particularly focusing on modern slavery issues. We were finalists in the ED Awards. We didn't win, but we're in the top 3. And we were also on the authoring committee for the British standard I mentioned earlier on. And my colleague Helen is currently leading the UK drafting committee for developing an ISO standard. So it's ISO 30, I don't know how you say it, 37 2000 maybe, which is based on the British standard. So that's all about modern slavery and organisational approaches. We're also the delivery partner for the Supply Chain Sustainability School as well. Okay, so before we get started, I want to just make sure we're all on the same page in terms of our understanding of the risks of modern slavery and a reminder of the why as well, and also what we mean by due diligence. So slavery, it's the illegal exploitation of people for personal or commercial gain. It's where victims are trapped in servitude, which they were deceived or coerced into, and they cannot leave. When we think about slavery, though, we need to think about labour exploitation. The two go hand in hand. So when I talk about slavery today, I mean slavery and labour exploitation, but I'm just going to say slavery because of the time limits we've got. So exploiters will target people who are vulnerable, and the more exploited a person becomes, the more vulnerable they become, and the more likely it is that they become victim of slavery, which is the most extreme form of exploitation. So the stats here, this is the harsh reality. 50 million people estimated to be victims of slavery, according to the Global Slavery Index, and these numbers are increasing. There's about 122,000 estimated victims here on our doorstep in the UK. Car washes, adult social care, construction, warehousing, logistics, facilities management are just some of the high-risk areas here in the UK. Then when we think about those international supply chains, you can see some high-risk materials here. Electronics, all our technology, our cars, our phones, all high chance of containing slavery. Garments, solar PV and textiles. Have a look at these. I'm not going to talk through these examples. I just wanted to kind of flash this slide up so to highlight that the reputational risks are very real. Luxury brands, public sector, social care, waste, slavery and labour exploitation risks are everywhere. It's prevalent in most of the things that we buy, and yes, extremely low prices can be indicative of exploitation in the supply chain. But as you can see here, just because you are paying fair prices or even heightened prices for things, you can't assume there's no risk. And equally, just because organisations have policies and procedures in place, it doesn't mean to say that the risks of slavery are low. I would say that no business or supply chain can be considered at zero risk of slavery. Okay. So aside from the reputational risk, clearly there's that ethical imperative. However, we also need to be aware of the wider business case. So some examples here of the drivers. Legal compliance, especially with that growing wave of global due diligence legislation that's happening right now. Client requirements, investor and shareholder expectations, and supply chain resilience. These are all real valid business drivers for doing our modern slavery due diligence. Okay, so bear with me. We'll get to the assessment in a moment. First of all, what is due diligence? So there's a definition here. It's taken from the British Standard. It talks about due diligence as being an ongoing risk management process to identify, prevent, mitigate, and an account for how adverse impacts are addressed. in the organisation, and business associates. And this definition aligns with other frameworks like UN Guiding Principles or OECD. So it's about being really proactive. It's about taking proactive steps to prevent it, find it, and fix it. That's a really kind of nice, short way of saying it. It's not about making sweeping statements that, well, we're doing X, Y, Z, so we can be sure there's no slaves in our operations or supply chain. Organisations who make such claims, I would suggest, don't understand how prevalent the issue is. So the wheel you can see here on the right-hand side, this is from the tool that we've developed at Action Sustainability to assess organisations in how they're set up to address slavery and labour exploitation in their operations and supply chain. What we've done is we've broken it down into different chunks to help identify strengths and opportunities for improvement. So what we're doing today is a light touch version of this. It's a very high level assessment based on this tool. Modern slavery due diligence, as I'm sure you're aware, is a whopping great big topic, and we can't cover everything in 50 minutes. So there's my disclaimer. There will be a lot that won't actually be covered, but hopefully it will be useful for you. So you can see the outer circle here. It's got 3 headings. So what we're going to do is work through the headings in the inner circle. I'll guide you through each of these areas, what we need to be thinking about, and you can map out where you think your organisation is. So hopefully it'll become clear as we go along. And yes, there will be some overlap in each of these areas because everything's kind of intrinsically linked. And at times it will be a bit, I suppose, finger in the air at times, as you might need colleagues to respond accurately. But ultimately, I'm hoping to get you thinking about what good looks like and where you may be. Okay? So let's think about policy to start with, and that leadership and commitment piece. Your policy, your modern slavery policy, it should be a forward-looking document tailored to your organisation. It should set out the ambition, the direction of travel in relation to modern slavery, and ideally, it should have an implementation plan next to it, the how, including a RACI matrix. So, who's responsible, accountable, consulted, and informed. If you're using standards or frameworks, these should be in your policy. Lots of policies look a bit like a cut and paste kind of jobby. I also see lots of references to things like zero tolerance of modern slavery, or commitments to do X, Y, Z to ensure there's no slavery. So let's just think about that. Zero tolerance to modern slavery. What's that really telling anyone? My challenge will be, would any organisation within reason actually be tolerant of slavery? That's just kind of basic legal compliance. So let's think about the language we're using in our policies. A good modern slavery policy, it acknowledges the risk is very real, and it should commit to taking steps to that due diligence to prevent, identify, manage and mitigate the risks, and also how adverse impacts are addressed. Should link to other policies. If you think about it, modern slavery is linked to labour exploitation. We're talking about people here. People issues such as fairness, inclusion and respect, payment, employment conditions, procurement processes, they're all interlinked. So make this clear in your policy. Demonstrate your understanding of these interlinkages. Think about how they're communicated as well. Does your policy kind of sit in a file for people to find if they need it, or are you actually proactively communicating it? Do stakeholders understand their role in delivering the policy? Something I see a lot is that people hear about modern slavery, but they don't really think it's relevant to their role. They just think it's a kind of legal compliance issue. Might be that you have a wider human rights policy, which includes modern slavery. If you do, be mindful that human rights it's the umbrella heading above modern slavery, but that the scope of human rights is much broader than modern slavery. If you think about, according to the UN, we've got 30 basic human rights, and modern slavery is just, no slavery is just one of them. Okay, so hopefully I've got you thinking about your policy. So what I want you to do now is go back onto Menti and leave this going in the background. Okay, I'm just going to change my screen. There we go. So I'm going to go to the next question. I can see 60 of you are on there. So don't vote yet. Wait until you've heard me. I'm going to talk you through the different levels. So don't input your answers yet. So the question appears asking you which level you think your organisation is at. I'm going to talk through guidance for each level, Once I've done so, you can submit your response. Okay, and again, it's anonymous, so be honest. I have no way of knowing who's submitted what. Okay, so if you're at the kind of level of, actually, let me just pop the QR code up there again, and you've got the code and the link at the top of the screen as well. Don't submit your answers. I can see somebody has. Hold fire for now. So you've got kind of the first level, which is we haven't really considered this yet. So getting started. If you're at this level, you probably don't have a modern slavery policy in place, or maybe you have a policy that commits to satisfy legal obligations, but that's it, nothing more. At this level, you can probably find the policy on your website, but there's no proactive communications of it. And you might reference things like zero tolerance of slavery, or just that commitment to basic legal compliance. So pockets of good practice. At that level, you've got a tailored policy. So it's clearly not a cut and paste job. It's tailored to what your business does. I would expect to see some linkages to other people related policies, things like payment, sustainable procurement, and so on. At pockets of good practice, I'd expect this to be communicated to your employees in different ways. So maybe it's there in inductions, but there's also emails, agenda items on meetings, and this should be on your website as well, the policies on your website. So strategic, what does that look like? So if you're at strategic level, the language in your commitment is in line with the kind of find it, fix it, prevent it, the real due diligence. Those interlinkages we talked about with other people related issues are evident. So at strategic, you'll clearly have those links to other policies like right to work, prompt payment, sustainable procurement, responsible procurement, recruitment. I'm sure there's plenty more. And you'll also have a comms policy and strategy, which dictates who to communicate with, when and how. So key stakeholders will be aware of the policy at that strategic level. Okay, so embedded. It's what it says on the tin, I suppose. If you're at the embedded level, your policy not only sets out the direction of travel, but it has the all-important implementation strategy, or that RACI, the responsible, accountable, consulted and informed. Your policy at this level references any standards you use, any guidelines. It talks about key stakeholders. It talks about regulations. Everybody, when it's embedded, everybody knows about the policy and they understand their role in delivering the policy. And it aligns with the wider organizational mission and values. Okay, so that's embedded. And as I go through this, I would say it's very rare from my experience that organizations are embedded in any of these areas. So hopefully that kind of frames things a little bit. So I can see you're starting to put in your responses, which is great. I'm just going to get rid of the joining instructions. So I can see that quite a lot of you are at pockets of good practice, which is brilliant. Okay, that's great. And I'll share all these with you afterwards. Okay, so keep that open because we're going to come back to that in a moment. So let's move on now to look at governance. Okay, so governance. When we're talking about governance, we're thinking about top management or oversight bodies. So an oversight body, if you're a small business, that could be the owner. So how do top management or those oversight bodies, how do they integrate modern slavery risk management into all those organizational activities? Recruitment, operations, procurement, contract management. Do they demonstrate leadership and commitment in doing so? Do top management understand why you need to address modern slavery risks and why you need to take action? So, for example, if you were to ask somebody in your senior leadership team, why is modern slavery important? Could they actually articulate the business case? Or might they just say, well, it's to do with the Modern Slavery Act and legal compliance? Or could they explain the wider business drivers about your clients, about reputational risk, about supply chain resilience, about social value? If they can do that, it's much more likely you'll have that risk management integrated into wider, I suppose, organizational governance requirements, into that business as usual, which is really critical. So also think about, where does ownership for modern slavery risk management sit? Is it at board level or senior leadership team? So let's go on to Menti again. Okay, I'm going to jump to the next question. So again, I'm going to talk through the levels. Getting started. At getting started, I'd say top management have a basic understanding of some of the reasons why you need to combat slavery, but there's no real process in place that relates to this. At pockets of good practice, I would say your senior leaders, your top management have quite a good grasp of the business case to address modern slavery risks. You've got some processes in place to review and respond to these drivers. You might be planning to integrate modern slavery risk management into those wider organisational governance requirements, but you're not quite there yet. At pockets of good practice, I would say you've probably got some resource allocated for combating slavery, but it's mainly compliance focused. Okay, so let's think about strategic. At strategic, I would say your modern slavery risk management is just part of your existing governance structure. You'll have formalized processes in place to review the drivers for combating slavery, which then informs what actions you take. I would say it's strategic. All staff, everybody feels supported and empowered to tackle slavery. And you start to see those signs of kind of, putting money where your mouth is. So there's adequate resource made available to conduct that modern slavery due diligence. At embedded, I would say you've got those processes in place for reviewing organizational drivers to combat slavery. Everybody in the business understands why this is important. You've got oversight at board level. There's that widespread acknowledgement that modern slavery risks are just one of the many business risks considered and reviewed regularly. And at embedded, I'd say top management are real advocates for combating slavery and labour exploitation. And they engage in things like stakeholder forums to share knowledge. That's so important, that collaborative piece. Okay. So again, we've got neck and neck with getting started and pockets of good practice, and a few are at, we've got one embedded. Fantastic. I'd love you to get in touch with me and tell me more about that. We're always looking for people to share case studies on best practice. So fantastic. Thank you. Okay, so let's have a look at the next one. So let's think about roles and responsibilities next. So this is building on that idea of the RACI matrix I mentioned earlier. So you can see that in front of you. Think about the evolution of health and safety. So back in the day, you would have had one person who'd been allocated responsibility for health and safety, whereas nowadays it's just part and parcel of what we do. It's embedded into everything that we do. So this is where we're looking to get to with modern slavery and labour exploitation. Everyone has a role to play in modern slavery due diligence. We all need to prevent, identify, manage and mitigate the risks. Recruitment, operations, procurement, senior management. And it's about empowering people. It's about allocating sufficient resource and driving a culture of collaboration as well. So let's jump on to Menti. Okay, so getting started. My thinking here is maybe you've got one person in the business who's been given responsibility for addressing modern slavery risk. This could be an informal role, or maybe it's someone who's enthusiastic about the topic, or maybe somebody in your legal team who's been given the responsibility because of compliance with the Modern Slavery Act. That tends to be quite common. So that's getting started. So pockets of good practice. So you've probably got somebody who's directly responsible for modern slavery due diligence, and this is reflected in their job description. Okay, so we're starting to think about job descriptions as well. At this level, at pockets of good practice, I would expect procurement and supply chain teams to also have been assigned a role in managing and mitigating the risk. Okay, let's think about strategic. Strategic, so I would say here, risk management is mapped to key roles across the organisation. Those roles I've mentioned previously: recruitment, operations, supply chain, procurement, senior management, just to name a few. If it's embedded, I would say that modern slavery risk management, it's seen as the responsibility of everybody. Everyone understands their role in modern slavery due diligence, and they're also empowered to recognise and report any concerns. It just forms part of the organisation's culture. Okay, so we've got a few not yet considered this. Okay, that makes sense. About 15 of you are getting started. A few of you are still thinking. If if you're still struggling with Menti, you can see the code, the link at the top, menti.com, and you've got the code there, 19673517. Okay. So let's have a look now at risk assessment. Okay, this is a huge topic. What we're getting at here is how you identify, analyse and evaluate exposure to modern slavery risk. So risk assessment is the critical building block for all your modern slavery due diligence activities. And it's your risk assessment that should inform that prioritised approach. You have to take a prioritised approach. You can't tackle every single risk. From my experience, organisations often jump straight into supply chain risks without thinking about their operational risks. So don't forget those operational risks. Here are some examples here of where the risks will sit. And here are examples of, I haven't got the slide in. I've got some examples of where you can, resources you can use to identify the risk. I'll add that into the slide deck before we circulate it. So let's jump on to Menti. Let's have a look at risk assessment. So if you're getting started, I would say your organisation has acknowledged and recognised there are risks, but you haven't yet begun to assess the risk. So that's kind of getting started. Pockets of good practice. You've probably assessed the risks in maybe either your operations or in your supply chain. For example, you might have identified that there are risks in solar PV supply chain, or you're aware that you employ most of your workers through labour agencies in low skilled or low paid roles. So you realise there's a risk there. However, at pockets of good practice, you probably don't have a formal process to assess the risk. It's a bit ad hoc, maybe done by one person or a smaller group, and it's reactive. So you might see coverage in the media of the risks linked to, say, solar PV or cleaners, labour agencies, and you've then thought, oh, I'll dig around to find out what due diligence we're doing in these areas. So that's pockets of good practice. Strategic, I'd say it's a bit of a jump. Here you've assessed the risks in both your operations and your supply chain, and you've done this with multiple stakeholders. It's not just, Sarah from Modern Slavery team and Joanne from Sustainability team or legal, whatever it may be. It's multiple stakeholders. And the risk assessment itself has been informed by referring to resources like Global Slavery Index, Corruptions Perceptions Index, Design for Freedom Toolkit. There's lots of resource out there to help you identify where those risks are. At strategic, I'd say you've evaluated and prioritized those risks to determine where best to focus your efforts. Okay. So then if we think about embedded levels, so I'd say the risk assessment, when it's embedded, it's just done systematically and collaboratively. So you involve a wide pool of stakeholders, maybe even peers thinking about those collaborative groups. You're really proactive in your approach. So for example, if you have categories of spend, let's think back to when the war in Ukraine began. If you have categories of spend with low skilled or low paid roles, where there's low barriers to entry, when the Ukraine war began and many refugees came to the UK, you would have immediately recognised that many of these refugees they'd be vulnerable, as they wouldn't be native English speakers, or maybe they wouldn't understand their entitlements. So they'd be a prime target for exploiters. So you'd be responding to that risk proactively. Okay. At embedded as well, I'd say that risks are evaluated taking into account the scale and scope of the impact. So that's thinking about risk to people as well as risks to the business. You'd also be thinking about leverage. So, well, how can I influence what's happening here? What leverage do you have to reduce the risk? At embedded level, the results of the risk assessment and evaluation, it then determines what actions you take. So at this level, you'd be recording the risks, you'd be reporting against them, and that would inform future due diligence activities. Okay, great. That's great to see that there's 3 of you at embedded, quite a few at strategic. So that's really promising to see. Okay, right. Let's have a look at support. So this is thinking about what kind of resources have been allocated. It could be training, it could be budgets for specific roles or tools. This links back to the governance piece and that piece around putting money where your mouth is as well. Think about competency assessment. I can't say that. Think about competency assessments. What processes do you have in place to build the competencies needed to combat modern slavery risks. And again, remember, every time I say modern slavery, I mean labour exploitation as well. Who needs to know what? How is that communicated? What training do you have in place on things like processes, methods, and tools to manage the risk of slavery? Some examples here of competency assessments for modern slavery risk management. This is just an example. This isn't kind of everything, but it's just to get you thinking. Okay, so let's have a look back to Menti. Let's have a look at support. So getting started, I'd say you've probably got some basic training and awareness available, maybe like a short video or a PowerPoint pack about what is slavery and how to spot the signs. Everyone maybe should have completed it, but it's a bit of a, sheep dip approach. Everybody does it, it's one off, and it's kind of forgotten after that. At getting started, you might have some idea of what competencies are needed for specific roles, but you haven't put anything in place. So you've certainly got no competency matrices or assessments or anything like that. Pockets of good practice. I'd say here you've probably got some budget allocated over and above the basic training we talked about a second ago. All staff have had basic training on how to spot the signs and what action to take if they have any suspicions. I'd say at pockets of good practice as well, you've started to conduct a bit of a competency assessment and you've identified some requirements for key disciplines, so procurement or operations or recruitment, resulting in some tailored training having been identified, but again, pockets of good practice. Strategic, I'd say you have a clear resource plan there. There's investment in upskilling, there's investment in different roles, there's investment in provision of guidance, tools, training, linking back to that competency assessment. The training here would include the specifics relating to processes, policy requirements, and risks. I would say it's strategic. You'd have different types of competency building activities. So you'd have things like personal development plans, networking, mentoring, knowledge sharing, and performance evaluations. Embedded. I'd say embedded, you'd have a range of different resources provided. The key differentiator here is that the resource is allocated to the supply chain as well to support them in their due diligence. We'll talk about this shortly, but this is about collaborating with the supply chain and offering that helping hand rather than risk dumping. It's collaborating with them, offering to help. So here at Embedded, I'd say everyone can demonstrate the competencies required and people are provided with that training, the education, and those development opportunities. You'll also require your suppliers or subcontractors who work on your behalf to demonstrate that their employees have the required competencies in managing the risks of slavery and labour exploitation. So it starts to have that cascade effect. You'll also have a track record of implementation and continuous improvement here. Okay. Right, so I can see that here, interesting actually, it's more people are at the getting started side of things. And again, this is quite familiar. I feel like many organisations have started to think about this, but they don't really have that kind of competency framework in place that includes modern slavery. Okay. No, stay on Menti on this one. We're about to talk about procurement, and I didn't do a slide on that one. So procurement is obviously a huge topic. When we do this with our clients, we have 4 different questions related to procurement that are split into those different stages of procurement. There's plan, source, manage, and then all the things you can do outside of the procurement process. However, as we only have a short amount of time, I've condensed this so into one question. So let's think about getting started. If you're getting started, I'd say modern slavery is mentioned in your procurement policy. You probably ask some basic questions in your pre-qual process and tender, but they're compliance-based questions. Do you have a modern slavery? Are you compliant with the Modern Slavery Act? Once the contract is let, the assumption is that the supplier or subcontractor, they're legally compliant, they're managing any modern slavery risks, and there's no follow-up at all through that contract management process. So a simple kind of compliance-based approach that will be getting started. Pockets of good practice. I'd say you've probably started to do some work on analysing where the risks may be and you prioritise some key categories for modern slavery inclusions. Okay. Consequently, you've included some requirements in the procurement process that relate to modern slavery risk. So, for example, there might be a requirement for a high-risk supplier to conduct their own risk assessments or audits, or to pay the real living wage. You'd have specific contract requirements having been developed that reflect the nature and extent of the risk. And your contract managers for these high-risk categories will be aware of the risks and are starting to manage these as part of core contract management. So that will be pockets of good practice. Outside of the procurement process at pockets of good practice, I'd say you've probably identified some other high-risk categories of spend, and you've got a plan of engagement in place to understand, well, what due diligence is out there and where are the potential areas for improvement. So let's say you might know you're going to be retendering for a facilities management contract. So you're proactive in understanding the risks in that sector and researching specific standards or collaborations that exist to address the challenges in that sector. Okay. Strategic, that would be throughout the pre-qualification and tendering requirements, the level of risk identified for specific categories of spend is reflected. You've got metrics in there that have been identified. The metrics are embedded into those procurement requirements, and that doesn't get forgotten at the contract management stage. Through the contract management, data is collected, and it just forms part of, your day-to-day performance management requirements. The entire procurement process at strategic would foster that culture of collaboration. Supplier development is critical. Excuse me. And the challenges faced around modern slavery and labour exploitation, they're acknowledged as shared challenges. And the supply chain are actively encouraged to share ideas on how we can address these problems together. And the outcome and learnings from all of this consistently feed into what happens in future procurement activities. And then embedded. Again, I'm yet to meet an organisation that has this fully embedded that I'm aware of. This is where you can evidence continuous improvement in your procurements. You can evidence how contract requirements have been applied, measured, and reported, and how this has informed future procurements. You can evidence how this approach is then being cascaded down through your supply chain. You've got those supplier relationship management programs in place, supply development initiatives, and you're really proactive in industry collaborations that look to see how you can leverage combined procurement power to drive improvements in modern slavery due diligence. Okay, so there's a lot in that one. And I can see, again, most of you are getting started. A few of you, probably the same people embedded at this level as at the other levels, especially risk assessment as well. Okay. So let's think about recruitment and employment conditions. So this is about ensuring that workers are aware of their rights, that all the correct payment mechanisms are in place, and that this should all be reflected in their written terms and conditions. And employees need access to these both before and during employment. Sounds really basic, but I've heard lots of horror stories coming out of things like site audits or worker voice surveys where workers don't actually know what their entitlements are, or they've never actually been given written terms and conditions. I know that's a key challenge in the construction sector. If people don't understand what they're entitled to, that the kind of things you can see here, they could be easily exploited, especially if they're a migrant worker who doesn't speak the local language. It's also about ensuring that everybody involved in any aspect of recruitment, any aspect at all, that they understand modern slavery and worker vulnerabilities. They need to be trained, they need to be competent in knowing how to spot the signs, why it's important to try to spot the signs, and what to do if they have any concerns, and why it's important again. That's really critical. There's an example here of one of the multilingual posters available from Gangmaster and Labour Abuse Authority. Easy to download, and this helps raise awareness of worker rights to protect them from exploitation. Here are some lessons learned from Operation Fort, which you may have heard of. These are specific to recruitment, the lessons learned here, but Operation Fort was one of the UK's largest anti-slavery prosecutions. Recruitment agencies were infiltrated. The techniques they used were very sophisticated. One lady who was an exploiter, she was a supervisor and manager in a labour agency. She was also the only Polish speaker, exploiting a lot of Polish nationals. It's also about how you monitor and report recruitment practices as well to ensure that the processes are clear and fair. Things like employer is responsible for any associated costs. And of course, there's that piece around upholding and promoting worker empowerment. Okay, so let's have a look at what that means in terms of maturity. Right, so getting started. I would say that workers at this level, they're informed of their rights prior to employment. They've got it in writing. All staff involved in recruitment have had some basic training on modern slavery. Workers have a right to join a trade union and to bargain collectively. You've probably got some responsible recruitment processes in place as well, but these are predominantly compliance focused. At pockets of good practice, I'd say that all your employees and workers, they've got ongoing access to written terms and conditions, as well as other relevant organisational policies and procedures. There's probably some awareness programs in place to remind them of their rights. So things like the posters we looked at earlier on. At pockets of good practice, recruitment teams have more advanced training available in different formats. So things like e-learning, videos, guidance documents, but it's probably not mandated. And your organisation fosters those constructive relationships with trade unions. Okay. At strategic, I'd say you've got regular proactive engagement with workers using different types of communication. So apps, social media, toolbox talks, posters. Grievance mechanisms are always signposted to in communications, how and when to report concerns. I'd say it's strategic. Recruitment, people with recruitment roles have completion of regular modern slavery awareness training just embedded into their performance objectives. Everyone involved in recruitment understands the risks to the business and individuals, to people, and their role in addressing slavery. I'd say recruitment practices would be monitored. You might use assessments and audits to ensure that workers are aware of their entitlements. And at strategic, workers should be confident that they will not be discriminated against as a result of things like engagement with unions. At embedded, I'd say it's everything I mentioned earlier, but here it's really clear you foster an environment of it's that openness and trust with workers. So workers can submit concerns in a range of different ways. You'd have maybe worker voice surveys being carried out and a really proactive approach to capture feedback. People in recruitment, training for recruiters and workers would be available in different formats. You might use different forums to share learning and insights. And if, let's say, you found workers are found to have been forced to pay recruitment fees, you'd then advocate for those to be paid back. You'd also be highlighting how this is what you'd expect to see from your supply chain as well. Okay, so where are we at with this one? So nobody embedded so far on this one. Okay, more of you at pockets of good practice. Yep, and strategics, that's good. And again, some of you not yet considered that. Okay. Right, I think we've got about 3 more to go, so bear with me. Recording and reporting. So this is about building in those metrics and KPIs into your everyday processes to help you monitor and measure what actions you're taking to address slavery, and also how effective is your due diligence. How are these embedded into your standard risk management systems? I often see quite a few organisations who have KPIs around training and awareness, like the number of people trained or number of specific roles. But then I see businesses sometimes start to get a bit stuck as to what they can measure and how. So let's have a look at how this breaks down. So getting started, I'd say you've probably got some metrics that relate to training intervention, so X number of people trained internally. At pockets of good practice, you'll have a suite of metrics in place. So they'll cover areas such as training, Maybe things like supply chain mapping, remediation activity, maybe number of reports and incidents, although that one is interesting because if nobody's reporting any concerns or grievances, that could be indicative of people actually not understanding what to look for or why it's important. Or it could be because what you're doing really well on the prevention piece. So just be wary of that one around number of reports and incidents. So at strategic, I'd say you've got some metrics there, and these are embedded into your organizational performance metrics. And they're reflected in your disclosure statement. So for example, in your modern slavery statement, which should talk about what actions you've taken to combat slavery and how you're monitoring and measuring progress here. At strategic, I'd say there's clear lines of responsibility for measurement and reporting requirements. So you might have mechanisms in place to monitor current due diligence activity, things like audits or surveys. If it's embedded, if you're at the embedded stage, I'd say metrics are reviewed at senior management level. They form part of the wider suite of business reporting. And this is when you can start to evidence how the outputs from the monitoring mechanisms are then how they're influencing continuous improvement going forward. Okay. Again, nobody is embedded, and more of you are not yet considered. Again, that sounds fairly familiar. I know it's different in different sectors, but this does not look, this looks fairly common. Okay. So let me go back to my slides. Let's have a look at grievance mechanisms. So this is about what's in place to flag concerns either about others, but also awareness of how workers can report concerns themselves. It's also about how you investigate any concerns and what processes are in place to do this effectively. It's all well and good as well to have mechanisms in place, but I would always challenge organisations to say, do people know about them? Do they understand why it's important to use them if they have any concerns? I've heard so many anecdotes from people, site managers, people who are working with operatives who say, yep, I have spotted things that didn't look quite right, but I didn't report them for various reasons. For example, well, I wasn't sure it was slavery, or I didn't want to get anyone into trouble, or I wasn't sure who to contact. So it's about being set up to, and so it's about communicating that, making sure people know what the grievance mechanisms are and why they should use them and how to use them. It's also about being set up to respond to concerns that are reported. So we once, a while ago, had an individual from a large organisation call us during a holiday period to say, someone's raised a concern about modern slavery, what do we do now? Make sure you're set up to deal with that as and when it happens. Okay, so let's have a look at what this looks like on the assessment. So I'd say at getting started, you don't have any grievance mechanisms, or you do, but it's more generic whistleblowing. So there's no mention of reporting concerns around labour exploitation or slavery. At pockets of good practice, I'd say you've got mechanisms available for maybe internal and external reporting of concerns, which may include modern slavery and labour exploitation, but your investigation process that sits behind is probably more set up for things like bribery and corruption. I'd say at pockets of good practice, you'd have some awareness. There'd be some awareness or communication of these grievance mechanisms, but you could do a lot more. Okay. Strategic. So this is where grievance mechanisms are available and they reference modern slavery and labour exploitation. They're communicated regularly and proactively in a range of different formats. So different people respond to different ways of communication, and also languages as well. If you've got low skilled, low paid workers, high use of migrant workers, think about languages as well. They're communicated to both internal employees and the supply chain. And on the sites, for example, where you operate, you'd be able to report concerns anonymously. It's really clear you can report anonymously. And the systems are set up to deal with modern slavery. And there's a widespread awareness that there are no negative reprisals for reporting any concerns. So that should never be a barrier for people not reporting, for people reporting. Embedded. So I'd say if this is embedded, you'd have multiple routes to raise concerns. You'd have anonymous reporting to organisations like Unseen's Modern Slavery Helpline. You will have removed any barriers that could have got in the way of people flagging concerns like those we talked about a minute ago. Your grievance mechanisms are shared with your business associates, your supply chain. Anyone can use those grievance mechanisms. And people know what happens next if they do raise a concern. Very often I hear businesses say, well, I don't know what happens if I do raise a concern, and that can put them off as well. So people know what happens, and investigations are done in a timely and transparent way. And you prioritize the health and safety of affected workers and other potential victims. So I would say that's embedded. So that's interesting. One of you has got that at the embedded stage, one at strategic, quite a few of you not yet considered. When we start to talk about remediation in a moment, I would say grievance and remediation is one of those areas where businesses have got a lot of work to do. Okay, so let's have a look at remediation. So I'm really interested to see where you are on this. So this is it's about remedial actions and processes that are aimed at identifying and stopping slavery which is occurring, as well as preventing future occurrences. It's also about processes and actions that are aimed at providing remedy to people or groups that have been harmed. So how are you supporting those people who've been impacted? What's the extent of the support, and what policies and processes do you have on this? You don't want to be the organisation that finds a potential victim and then doesn't know what to do next. It's critical that any concerns are acted on in a responsible way, because it's people's lives here we're talking about, and that it's concerns are acted on in a way that prioritises the needs of an individual and that protects them. People often think about modern slavery remediation as being money. They think of financial compensation. If any of you have met any survivors with lived experience or have heard them speak at any events, they will tell you that financial compensation is just the tip of the iceberg. They'll also articulate how important it is to involve them in any discussions about their remediation. It's kind of stating the obvious, but sometimes and far too often a policy or a process may kick in that doesn't actually involve engagement with the victims themselves. Okay, so this is the last one. So let's have a look. So getting started. I would say getting started, you don't have any policies or processes in place here, other than maybe a simple referral to an organisation that can connect somebody to the National Referral Mechanism, or referred to as the NRM. That's the government-backed framework for identifying and referring potential victims. So you might talk about ending relationships with suppliers if any instances of slavery are found, which is not great, which we'll look at in a moment. Pockets of good practice. You might have had some discussions around how you would support individuals or groups that have been exploited, but these haven't been formalised. So, for example, you may have talked about engaging with charities that support victims of slavery, like Ride for Freedom or Causeway, as some examples, Bright Future. At strategic, I'd say you have a formal policy, a remediation policy and procedure in place that provides remedy to individuals that have been impacted. That process, it's communicated to relevant stakeholders. The needs and concerns of the victims, excuse me, are prioritised. At this level, you understand that if slavery is found in your supply chain, you need to go beyond corrective action plans with suppliers. You need to instead focus on ways to engage and support your suppliers, not cut off ties with them, because that's not helping anyone. If it's embedded, I would say the needs and concerns of victims are prioritised, and this is reflected in your organisational processes. Resource is available to understand, how did this happen in the first place? What was the root cause? And did you cause or contribute to the situation in the first place? For example, suddenly shortening your lead times, demanding lower costs. What will you do differently to prevent the situation from occurring again? You might work with authorities and stakeholders to support effective remediation beyond that monetary compensation. Might be helping survivors back into employment. There's a great new platform available through Causeway and Bright Future to facilitate this. Or with things like Ride for Freedom, it's about providing bikes to victims to give some of their freedom back. It's about involving survivors with lived experience in the development of your remediation policies and processes. So at this level as well, you'd also be fostering trust with suppliers, to encourage suppliers to identify issues and work towards continuous improvement. Okay. Right. So you'll all be exhausted after that. So that was a very quick kind of whiz through. So it brings us to the end of the assessment. What happens next? Hopefully you're all feeling inspired. You've got some ideas on improvements you can make. You might be feeling pleased that you're doing better than others, or it might feel a bit overwhelming about the amount of work to do, but hopefully things are a bit clearer. And remember, a prioritized approach with risk assessment as that kind of foundational level is absolutely critical. So I'll share the Menti results with you in the slide deck. And if you'd like to discuss how we could support you with your due diligence, I think there's a link being put in the chat where you can book in a call with me. When we do this maturity assessment and gap analysis with our clients, we tend to have a kind of a three-staged approach. So we do a desktop review of key policies and processes, maybe interviews with people from across an organization. We then run a face-to-face interactive workshop with leads from across the business, HR, legal, commercial, supply chain, client-facing, board members. Then we do a report to demonstrate findings and progress, strengths and opportunities to improve. And we'd provide a set of actions or recommendations that are heat mapped for ease and impact. We've recently been through this process with DEFRA and some of their arm's length bodies, and we're going to be publishing a case study soon, so keep an eye out for that. We've also recently completed this process with Tilbury Douglas. So my contact details are there. We literally have about 3 minutes. I did say we may not have time to do lots of questions, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and have a look in the Q&A. Okay, first question. Can you elaborate on the difference between a modern slavery policy and what's covered in a modern slavery and human trafficking statement? So the key difference there is the policy should be the forward-looking piece, and the modern slavery statement, in line with requirements in the Modern Slavery Act, it's the historical. It's looking back. What steps have you taken to combat slavery and labour exploitation in your operations and supply chain? So the policy is forward-looking. The statement is looking back. So if you've been doing your modern slavery due diligence well, your statement just should write itself. Okay. Can you advise publicly available source that would indicate risks for forced labour by industry and by country? Yes, absolutely. I did have a slide, but I'd somehow managed to miss it out. So the Global Slavery Index, there's the Corruptions Perception Index, there's the there's one that's used by the US Border Force, and what's it called, list of goods produced with forced labour, and you can look by country or by category. So yes, there's a whole selection. I'll definitely signpost to those after this webinar. Somebody's asked about metrics in procurement and tendering, which we mentioned. So they could be things like oh, my brain's gone. I've been talking too much. Things like, what percentage of your supply chain, your high-risk supply chain, have you mapped? So have you done, what risk assessment have you conducted with your own supply chain? You could be asking questions about grievance mechanisms, if you have grievance mechanisms available, and if they're available to your supply chain. Again, I can include some examples of that. So we've got 1 minute left. I can see there's another question there. Do you suggest organisations have their own grievance mechanisms, or can they point to the Modern Slavery Helpline? I would recommend, for grievance mechanisms, there are different ways to flag a grievance. I would say signpost to internal mechanisms, whether that be internal anonymous, also, line management and so on, but also signpost to external organisations. So I would say having as many opportunities to flag to different organisations, to different people, different ways to flag concerns is better, because you're taking away the barriers. Some people will not, no matter, even if they told it's anonymous, they won't be comfortable to flag a concern internally. So if you can provide Unseen's Modern Slavery Helpline, provide that there as well. So I would say that's best practice. Okay, it's 12 o'clock. I hope it hasn't been too much of a rush through everything. It's the first time we've done this, so a lot to cover, but I hope you found it useful. We will send out to you a copy of the recording, a copy of the slide deck. I'll also review the questions and make sure I include some links to resources that can help. So thank you, everybody. I hope you found it useful and look forward to seeing you at future webinars.